Hi, grade 7. Welcome here to a really low-tech lecture. I'm going to go dig into detail of Chapter 7. After the Great Migration, there was a huge push for democracy. Now, we often think of that, well, everybody gets to vote, everybody gets to have a say in the government, but that was not happening in British North America at this time. It was totally run by a governor, and he had all say, and a lot of the common people didn't really have much say in how the colony was run. They really wanted that to change. And this is huge for us in Canada now, because what happened in the past that we're looking at now plays out directly to how our country is run today. So I'm going to go into detail. Well, how did those people that lived there way back when actually get democracy going? Little recap here. So if you remember from last week, the Great Migration from 1815 to 1850, it started because in Britain overseas, there was so much poverty, famine, and unemployment in Britain that the government there that was encouraging people to move to their colony of British North America because there was more opportunities there. This resulted in more British people in British North America, which the government at the time was like, yes, I want it to be a more British government, British country anyways. I want to kind of push out all those French Canadians. It resulted in more pressure for land for farms, which had a negative result for First Nations, who again were getting pushed off the land, especially further west, if we think of the common day Ontario area. And there was more desire for reform in government, which we're going to explore today, a democratic government. So let's look a little bit more in detail of what was actually going on. What did the population actually look like at this time? So there was a much greater British population, which so many of you caught on to in your assignment last week. So there are two distinct areas we're going to look at today that are growing really, really largely with that immigration of all those people from Britain and other parts of Europe. Upper Canada, which is today Ontario, and Lower Canada, which we think of today as Quebec. So remember, we're around in the 1830s. So this is way, way, way back before Canada even became a country. So the population in Upper Canada were mostly farmers. They were English, merchants who were English, and professional men who were English. Notice the theme here. It was a great big English or British population, which the British government at the time was like, yes, that's what we want, more British people. And they were controlled by a small group of rich Englishmen called the Family Compact in government. We're going to go into more detail into that. And if we look over here into Lower Canada, which is present-day Quebec, they're made of the habitants, which were the French farmers. They also had merchants, many of them who were English and French, and professional men who were Frenchmen. If you think of like doctors, lawyers, that's kind of what we mean by professional men, same as over here. People who had really built up into the middle class, starting to make more money and having a little bit more time to contribute to more society with their money. Now, Lower Canada was all controlled by a wealthy group of English merchants called the Chateau clique in government. So each of these areas, Lower Canada and Upper Canada, had their own governments to make decisions for that area, and all this area, the colony of British North America, was controlled by a governor appointed by Britain to make decisions. So we're going to go in detail today of how these two groups worked, how these two groups really got frustrated with things that were going on, and kind of how things changed. So like I said before, these colonists, both in Upper and Lower Canada, wanted change. Well, why? Well, they wanted more power and say in their government. The British government was like, I don't know if I want any more say. I really like the control I am having right now. And the people who wanted change, who are called reformers, people who want to reform things or people who want to change things, are like, no, we don't like the way things are done in Upper and in Lower Canada. Let's change things. So let's take a little look at what did their government actually look like at the time. So we're going to look at this side of the screen. And right now at this time in British North America, they had what was called a colonial government. Now Britain, the country way across the sea that controlled this colony, would appoint a governor. He gave directions and insight, basically carried out the wishes of the British government way over in England of what to do with the colony. He, in turn, appointed a council, a group of men. Notice how it's not women. There's definitely not First Nations in here either. He appointed a council whose job was to make decisions about the colony's affair, the day-to-day affairs. They also advised the governor to say, hey, this is what's going on here. And he's like, okay, well, how about this decision? I want you to do this. Okay, that'll work. We'll do it. So these guys had all the power. Now, if you look at the everyday people living there, their power is way at the bottom. There was voters, and again, these are just male, mostly white men who have property. They elected and voted in the assembly. But the assembly this time only advised the council. They didn't have really any power at all. And this situation was very frustrating for the people living there. If we think back to these people, the farmers, the middle-class merchants, and the professionals, they didn't have as much say in government. It was all these wealthy groups of people in the council. They were buddy-buddy with the governor. He appointed them, and these guys made all decisions. That's very different than how our country is run today. And as you can see, this doesn't give much power at all to the majority of the population of either Upper or Lower Canada. And this frustrated the main population. They wanted change. They wanted what was more democratic government. And it's very similar to kind of a style of government that we see today in Canada. It's not exactly the same, but it's kind of like the first step of democratic government. And what they wanted was for the governor to have way less power, which would mean Great Britain would have way less power over their colony. They wanted the councils to actually be voted in by the assembly, and the assembly would be voted in by the voters. So instead of all the power being at the top, they wanted more say, more power in the bottom. So the people voted in who was the assembly. The assembly would appoint the council that made the decisions for the colony. And they would interact with the governor every once in a while, but they would have way more power than they would. So as you can see, this is a complete difference in government. I'm going to go over kind of some details of how it's big. These people wanted a big change in their government. So for the colonial government, they wanted voters to vote for the assembly to get more say. They wanted the assembly to vote in the council, not the governor like it was over here. And they wanted the council to make more power to make more decisions instead of the governor making all the decisions. So instead of having a colonial government, everybody at this time was really fighting for a more democratic government where common everyday people, well, I guess people who had money, would have more say than what it was right now, which was the governor and a select group of people. Now we're going to take a little look at what was actually going on in Lower Canada at this time. Now, Lower Canada, you're like, well, wait, it's actually looks higher on the map. Well, if you remember, the St. Lawrence River kind of comes in this way and it flows this way. They would say they were lower on the river. And if you wanted to get to Upper Canada, you have to go up the river to get there. That's where they got the name Lower Canada, Upper Canada. Just a little trivia for you. Well, in Lower Canada, as I talked about before, their council at the time was called the Chateau Clique. They were mostly rich Englishmen who made all the decisions for the colony. And this was frustrating because the majority of the population in Lower Canada was French. But they were being controlled by English people, so they were scared they were losing their identity and say. In the assembly at that time, people who wanted reform and more say, who right now didn't have much say, was a group called the Parti Canadien. They were mostly Frenchmen, but they could only advise the council, and they were led by a guy named Louis-Joseph Papineau. Now, it wasn't just people wanting change because they want change. Things were already also really tough. Very similar to how things are tough for us now. And you can see our government is under a lot of scrutiny for making good decisions because it affects a lot of people. At this time in Lower Canada, as you read last week, there was a cholera epidemic that was brought over by people immigrating. Remember, they had to quarantine for a bit. And there was 4 years in a row of crop failures, which means a lot of people were starving. So these everyday people wanted more change to help solve these problems. but they didn't have much say. These rich English people did, and that was very, very frustrating. In Upper Canada, it was a very similar thing going on. Here we have Upper Canada, which will later become, it's very small right now, but later become Ontario. Their council was run again by rich English guys noticing a trend that made all the decisions, called the Family Compact. And the Reform Party in the Assembly, elected by the voters, was mostly English, and they could only advise the council, and they were led by William Lyon Mackenzie. They also had crop failures, because although they're in a very similar area, so there's going to be a lot of similarities in how the farms are working. So for the last 4 years, they had tons of crop failures. And so again, people are starving. So both these groups in Upper and Lower Canada run by a select small group in the council of rich white men who protected their own interests. They weren't really taking care of most of everybody who was living there. There's also some outside forces that were making life really hard. So all this drove people for change. They wanted change in their government. They wanted things to be better. That's why people want change in government. Always hope for a better life of what the next group is going to bring. So these are the actual guys, like their haircuts. That was a style then, don't knock them. These were the reformers that really pushed for change in Lower Canada. This is Louis Joseph Papineau. He was leader in the Assembly at that time. Again, they just wanted more say in the government, especially for the French Canadians. And if you remember, Lower Canada was being controlled by English people or British people, but most of the population was French, and the French people weren't getting representation. In Upper Canada, William Lyon Mackenzie, he wanted, again, the people to elect their government. And it's interesting, too, even in Nova Scotia, further east, reform was going on, too. This guy named Joseph Howe really pushed for more say. So all across the colony, there's lots of people pushing for more say in government. Oh, just like any time there is a push for change, the people in power probably don't want the change to happen, because if change happens, that means they lose power. But the people below them who want more power and things to be better, these people fought back, and quite literally they fought back. So in both Upper and Lower Canada over the next year, there is actual uprisings and violence that people were so frustrated with people starving, people being sick, and having no say in government, that there was violence and riots in both Upper and Lower Canada. And this lasted for about a year of it going up and down, up and down, up and down. And finally, when it was starting to end down, Britain was like, okay, guys, this is enough. What is going on here? And they investigated, like, why did these rebellions happen? We don't know why people are so unhappy. Why aren't things running smoothly in the colony? And so Britain sent over from the country of Britain to the colony this guy named Lord Durham. He was their response to all these rebellions and all these reformers protesting what was going on. And today, your task is to look in detail. What did he come up with? What were his solutions for trying to make things okay in Upper and Lower Canada, to ease the tensions, to make people happy? And I hope you notice as you do your assignment today that, well, were his solutions actually really helpful or not? Again, he was supposed to investigate why the rebellions happened after Britain used violence and the military to literally squash, arrest, kill people to stop them from rioting. So things were crazy in Canada. You don't think of Canada often as having things like this happening, but it totally did. So hopefully this gives you just kind of a good overview to like the tensions that were happening, to people wanting a change in government from being colonial to just a few people having power to having the majority to have more power. And you're going to take a look again how Britain kind of tried to resolve tensions and conflict between people who didn't have much power to people that did.